Hello, LabourList viewers. My name is Muddassar Ahmed, and I'm a new columnist with LabourList. I've been tasked primarily with interviewing international figures of note and talking to them not just about Britain, but about international politics, global trends, but of course also the Labour Party. And I'm kicking off this series of interviews with Professor Buthelezi, who is the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. I should have said doctor. Yeah. Anyway, welcome and thank you for agreeing to do this interview with me. I'll start off by asking you to tell me a bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Thank you. I'm Mbongiseni Buthelezi. I am CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. The work that I do and the foundation does is what we call making good trouble. Making good trouble for peace, for democracy, for human rights in South Africa and in the world, as tasked to do by Nelson Mandela. That means being a voice, saying the things that need to be said, especially in this moment in the world, borrowing from what Nelson Mandela said in order to advance peace, democracy and human rights.
Now, your foundation also is the custodian of many important artifacts from Nelson Mandela's life. Tell us a bit about the physical building and the other artifacts that you have.
The building we're in was used as the foundation's offices and has an office that Nelson Mandela used from 2002 until 2010. After he stopped coming into the building in 2010, it was then converted into a permanent exhibition on his life, and we've preserved his office as it was on the last day that he was there. We also hold his papers in the archive. We hold the Nobel Peace Prize, among other things, and we are tasked with preserving that and looking after his intellectual property in perpetuity.
Wonderful. Now, I want to ask you about, on a more personal note a little bit, about a piece of art, a movie or a song that moved you recently.
I watched an incredible film on the flight here to New York on Ernest Cole, the South African photographer who went into exile and he lived here actually in New York for a long time and had recorded South African black life in incredible photographs before he left South Africa, for which he became famous. And then his career waned very quickly thereafter, and he became quite disillusioned and stopped taking photographs and eventually died quite poor. The film is done exceptionally well, and I found it very moving.
Thank you. I shall be sure to watch it. Now, we're both here in New York for the UN General Assembly. What are you most expecting or hoping to see at this year's gathering?
The General Assembly is an opportunity, I think, for countries to talk quite seriously about issues that are pressing in the world. Often we see sideshows that are not very helpful. But I think the most important thing for me this year is what has so far happened even before the General Assembly met. The recognition of the state of Palestine by key countries around the world, including France, Portugal, and others, and in fact the impending recognition by a further few countries.
Well, let's not forget the UK too.
Of course, the UK. I think that's a very, very significant development, and it is in some ways a game changer when it comes to the conversation that we're having about how to bring peace to Palestine. I'm hoping that, of course, that is the start of real change, even though some people are expressing their doubt about that. The other thing that I think it is necessary in the conversation that needs to be had is that for a long time Africa has been on the periphery, and African countries need to step up and need to be taken seriously. I'm hoping that that's one of the things that we are going to see progress on at this year's UNGA.
What priorities should African leaders be pressing for, do you think?
I think the one thing that is beginning to take a back seat in an unhelpful way is the global climate change peril that we face. I think that's something that needs to be brought back more forcefully onto the table, because we are seeing, the country I come from in South Africa, and even personally, I mean, we've seen the way in which changing climate and changing, particularly floods, have been affecting the eastern part of South Africa that I come from. In fact, I lost family members a few years ago. 5 family members died in the flood the day after my dad's funeral.
Sorry.
So that I think that's one of the critical things we need to be thinking about. Of course, the other thing that to me has been front of mind is technological advancement and what it means, especially given the young nature of the population in Africa. AI in particular is something that we need to be thinking harder about, how to make it accessible on one hand without repeating the old patterns of exploitation. At the same time, I think we need to be thinking quite hard about equity, questions of equity. That's something I think that needs to be put more forcefully on the table again.
Thank you. Around the world, populist and far-right movements are gaining ground. What lessons from South Africa's democratic journey might help progressives push back against those forces?
What South Africa teaches us, I think, if I want to just think back to the 1990s, the democratic transition. One of the things that we've managed to do, I think, successfully in South Africa was that in that moment of transition, the right-wing forces that were trying to derail the negotiations and derail the elections were contained. And they were contained through astute leadership and through opening channels for dialogue. And difficult dialogues were had in a way that was held and facilitated quite well. So that's one of the big lessons that South Africa offers to the world. And figures like Bishop Desmond Tutu, of course figures like Nelson Mandela, played a critical role in creating a container for having difficult conversations that needed to be had. I think for me, critically, dialogue is still important. And as we are seeing also in South Africa, the rise of right-wing forces, one of the things that we are thinking quite hard about at the Nelson Mandela Foundation is how do we now create a new dialogue that we need to have? Who are the figures like Nelson Mandela and the spaces like what the Nelson Mandela Foundation offers that can be spaces of long-term dialogue and the difficult dialogues that need to be had about how we live together without killing one another. The way in which right-wing forces, even in South Africa, are pushing agendas that are really narrow and that are about pushing other people to the margins again and even more forcefully so, is something that we absolutely have to push against. What also that requires for me is solidarity, and we need to be thinking about new forms of solidarity, emerging forms of solidarity that are not the old scripts. Who do we need to be in solidarity with that we haven't thought about, that we haven't thought we could have conversations with and sit in the same room. So we've tried this at the foundation actually already, and we're working on it as I speak, where we've thought, how do we respond to right-wing forces that are really trying to derail the gains that we've made in our democracy? And we started with a dialogue among people who, when the solidarity movement in South Africa came to the United States and said it was coming to talk to the Trump administration, it created a lot of difficulties for the South African government. And we thought, what is the role that we can play as a foundation to begin to create a space where we can bring people into a conversation that is about both countering that right-wing move, but also finding ways to reach out to them and say, let's talk about how we live together. So we're working on that, and we're working towards building that dialogue platform.
How interesting. Thank you. Both Labour in Britain and the ANC in South Africa have been accused of losing touch with ordinary voters. What lessons do you think they might share in trying to reconnect?
Sure, that's a difficult one. I think they've both, as we've seen from election outcomes and just the difficulties they've had over the last few years, that something has indeed happened where, as I've said of our leaders in South Africa, they stopped being able to hear us. And they stopped being able to hear us because there's a hubris, in a way, that set in at one point, and this distance between voters and the people that they elect into leadership has grown and grown. I think it's accurate to say that about Labour and to say that about the ANC. It's difficult to say what I mean, thinking from the South African experience, what the lessons could be, because the way we've gone in South Africa since last year, particularly the last national and provincial elections, was we found ourselves in a place where we had to draw lessons from the 1990s again, and go into coalition government, and call it the government of national unity. That was a very clever move, I think, on the part of the ANC. It connected into the memory of what the 1990s were for those of us who were young and growing up in that period. And there was something that moment in the 1990s was quite hairy and scary for us, but coming through it and landing up with something else where we were muddling our way forward without killing one another was a big lesson. And so I think we're now in a moment where the parties have to learn again how to muddle through and how to find how to connect with especially young people. This is something that we're seeing right-wing forces do quite successfully in the world. There's a way in which they've found a way of messaging and talking to young people who are disaffected by their lives getting worse than their parents' lives, by the leaders that they've put in position simply being unable to hear them. So it's to find ways to resonate, especially with young people. Find ways of messaging what you have to say for them that is also persuasive about how their lives are going to get better, how they're not going backward, they're not going to go backwards under your leadership, and find ways of communicating that just resonate. There's that's where I think progressive forces have failed over the last while, and right-wing forces have been able to just talk to people in a way that just, it hits at their gut and they resonate.
Now, South Africa has often pursued a non-aligned foreign policy, balancing ties with the West, China and Russia. How do you think that stance shapes its relationship with the UK at present?
The non-aligned stance has been interesting because at certain moments it seems difficult to sustain, especially when South Africa comes under pressure, for example, from the United States to take certain positions towards Russia. It comes under pressure sometimes internally in the country, when certain groupings that are influential are pushing in one direction or another. But I think it's been done quite successfully by the leadership of South Africa. How it shapes the relationships with the UK is not very clear, actually, to be sure. From my perspective, from within South Africa, it's not clear to many people what South Africa's relationship with the UK is currently. We know, about the trade relationships that South Africa is trying to maintain. Of course, the focus over the last while has been on the US a lot. There's been a lot of talk with US sanctions that have been threatened against South Africa. So I think there's that relationship between South Africa and the UK is not very prominent currently. It's not clear. And South Africa, I think, manages to continue to to hold its place where it maintains relationships with different countries, including the UK, without those relationships really sort of coming to the fore in public discourse in South Africa.
I mean, which part of Britain do you think South Africans relate to most?
Sure. That's a good question. Of course, I mean, I think Shakespeare. Right?
Yeah, so historically, but contemporary, when you think of Britain now.
You know, I'll say the one thing that has been quite striking to me as a literary scholar, cultural scholar, is the cultural dominance of the United States in some ways. There's something strange about how South Africans talk and think about certain countries in the world. The UK, I think, one of the things that's quite dominant in many people's minds is the historical imperial relationship. Right? It's when people talk about colonialism, that's the most immediate thing that they associate with the UK.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So those some of us, I mean, people like me who've lived and studied in the UK, associated with other things as well. I studied at the London Contemporary Dance School.
Right.
And I associated with that period of my life in my early 20s. Yeah.
Well, interesting you talk about culture. So African culture, whether it's Amapiano, Afrobeats, music, film or fashion, is now shaping global trends. How do you think this surge in soft power can translate into something bigger for the continent?
So I think one of the things, of course, is we've seen how certain artists, for example, have taken advantage of those opportunities. I think more of that needs to be done. South Africans in particular, if I think of South Africans, are still very insular in some ways and very comfortable being in South Africa. There are a few figures, DJ Black Coffee, who travel the world and take advantage of the opportunities being opened up in that way. But South Africans need to connect out into the world a little bit more, travel, get out of South Africa. We're too sedentary as South Africans. And those trends, I think the key thing for me is the business end of that is something that South Africans need to make sure that they've got control over. For far too long, I mean, in the one of the industries I've worked in is theatre in my life, and for a long time, a lot of South African theatre makers, actors, etc., were simply giving their intellectual property away. When they worked overseas, it was British companies, for example, that brought them out of South Africa to London to play in London, and exploiting them. I mean, that was one of the things I studied, is just the exploitation of Africans that was happening in those industries in the past. People have become wiser, and they've learned how the business of the music industry works, for example. And I think there's an opportunity there then for Africans to control their own narrative, to control their businesses themselves, to of course partner with others in other parts of the world. And I think I'm seeing more of that happening, and I hope more of that can be done.
Brilliant. Well, Dr. Buthelezi, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. My last question for you is Marmite, love it or hate it?
Absolutely hate it.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.